Hi everybody, my name is Brooke Schreier and I am the Assistant Coordinator with the Invading Species Awareness Program out of the Ontario Federation of Anglers and Hunters, and today I'm here to present to you the introduction and range expansion of white river crayfish, Procambarus acutus, to inland waters in Ontario. Without further ado, let's jump into it. So, just as a quick outline for today's presentation, I'm going to be going over Ontario's crayfishes. I really want to lay the foundation for the talk so that people understand, if you're not from Ontario, what crayfishes we have here in the province and what species are introduced already or invasive already, just so that you have a better baseline knowledge for the conversation today. And then after that, we're going to go into what is a white river crayfish. Following that, we'll get into some potential impacts, monitoring, and then finally we'll close out with next steps. So let's jump into Ontario's crayfishes. So as you can see here on the slide, we have 7 of our native crayfishes that are found in Ontario. Everything from common or a brook crayfish to a digger crayfish, big water, calico, northern clearwater, virile, Great Plains mudbug. So these are all native species which have varying distributions across Ontario. Then if we go to the next slide here, what you see here is actually an unknown as to whether or not it is a native or potentially introduced species. On the left, that is the painted hand mudbug, or Lacunii polychromatus. And as I said, its nativity is unknown, and it represents a very small distribution in southwestern Ontario near Windsor, Ontario. And this was actually, interestingly enough, an iNaturalist identification back in 2016. And that species actually has a lot of similarities with the species that we're going to be talking about today, which was also first recorded via iNaturalist. So on the right-hand side, you have 4 species of invaders that currently find themselves in Ontario to varying degrees. In the top left, you have rusty crayfish, which has been here since around the 1960s and was first introduced near Peterborough, Ontario. And it has now become widespread throughout the entirety of the province, everywhere from eastern, central, southwestern, all the way up to northwestern Ontario, and is having detrimental impacts, especially towards our native crayfish species, even through the likes of hybridization with the northern clearwater crayfish. Then moving on, in the bottom left, we have the white river crayfish, or Procambarus acutus, the focus of the talk today. And this one has been found in a few different locations, which we'll go over in a few minutes. And then in the top right, we have Procambarus virginalis, or a marbled crayfish, which first showed up in the province really over the last few years in ponds down in Burlington, Ontario. And if you have the opportunity to listen to Jeff Brinsmead's presentation that he'll be giving at ICAIS, please make sure that you do so, as he will be talking about what we've done to date on marbled crayfish. Finally, you have the obscure crayfish, or Allegheny crayfish, Faxonius obscurus, which has a much smaller distribution than that of rusty crayfish, but is another introduction to southern Ontario. So what is a white river crayfish? White river crayfish is a crayfish that is native to the United States of America, as well as parts of Mexico, northern Mexico. And as you can see here, it does have a disjunct distribution, meaning that its native distribution is actually broken up into 2 different ranges. And this is due to the Appalachian Mountains that you see there on the map. On the right-hand side of the eastern seaboard of the United States, you have one distribution ranging all the way down to Georgia, all the way north to the state of Maryland. And then in the central United States, you have that distribution all the way from Mexico, Texas in the south, all the way up to states like Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. So a fairly large native distribution, and it does physically closely resemble other Procambarus species, predominantly Xenangulus and Clarkii, so Procambarus xenangulus and Procambarus clarkii. And Zonangulus is almost indistinguishable, even genetically. So the only way you can really tell the difference between White River and Zonangulus is by doing the DNA work. Whereas Clarkii is also a very closely resembled species to White River crayfish, and you have to be quite knowledgeable around the identification of crayfish to determine the difference between these species. They're both fairly large-bodied, reddish in coloration, have tubercles, long, slender claws, etc. And so back in 2015, they were first introduced, White River crayfish were first introduced to Pelee Island in Lake Erie. And then now, unfortunately, they are found in the Port Severn region of Ontario. And if you're unfamiliar with where that is, that's up in this region right here. So Pelee Island is down here, and so if you look as the crow flies, it's quite a few hundred kilometers away. So obviously represents range expansion via human distribution, so most likely an introduction from, let's say, a bait bucket or something of the sort. So let's jump into some potential impacts. Something that was really interesting to note when we were first there was that we didn't initially find any White River crayfish when we did our monitoring, and we found native species. And then following the first monitoring event, when we went back, we didn't find any native species. So there is a direct competition between White River crayfish and our native crayfish species, and we've already anecdotally noticed that in the area where we've been monitoring. As I said, it is a suspected bait bucket introduction. It will inevitably have impacts on biodiversity. It will alter food webs. It will cause erosion via burrowing. There's one of its burrows there in the bottom left, and they're very deep. They're about the width of one's arm and can go more than 2 feet deep. So if they were to do this en masse, could definitely cause some mass erosion to shorelines, potentially leading to infrastructural damage. And then finally, they're voracious eaters. They seem to consume quite a bit, and the ones that we've had in captivity in the past have had a very large appetite. And as you can see in the top left picture there, that's actually a photo of a White River crayfish consuming a native juvenile crayfish. So there is direct predation that will occur between this species and our native species. So let's jump into our monitoring and what we've done to date. So as I said, back in 2015, it was the first records of White River crayfish appear on Pelee Island, and Dr. Thomas Hosey from Trent University is really the one who has been doing a lot of the monitoring and a lot of the research on this on Pelee Island. As you can see, all these photos here are from Dr. Thomas Hosey, and what him and Dr. Premack Hammer have found is that there are direct impacts to endangered salamander species, and also in terms of that island, the White River crayfish are having a direct impact on 2 native species, the digger crayfish and the calico crayfish. So now on that island, they are now established and reproducing on Pelee Island, and as I said, now they've been introduced to Port Severn region. So in October of 2022, we first saw reports of White River crayfish on iNaturalist, and it was brought to the attention of my program, ISAP, by Dr. Premack Hammer. We then went together to 6 Mile Lake. We went to 6 Mile Lake Provincial Park and the marina and another public park, and we looked at 3 different locations, and it was basically 15 kilometers by navigable water between those 3 sites. And we didn't find any crayfish, as I had mentioned, but we did find one individual who was working at the marina, and I asked her, I said, have you seen any crayfishes that may appear weird to you? And she said, you mean that lobster? And so she actually thought somebody had released a lobster because she said it was so large and so red, hence why she thought it was a lobster. And that's her photo there in the bottom right that she captured. And when I was there, I put my hand against it, and it was about 6 inches long, that crayfish, so a very large specimen. Then we did see one other living specimen, but unfortunately we were unable to catch it. So we went back the following year in July of 2023, and we went back to the same 3 locations that I mentioned, and this time within minutes, we captured a White River crayfish. Not only did we capture one, but we were just hand sampling, and we caught over a dozen White River crayfish at various spots along the waterway. As you can see there in the top left, my colleague Jeff has his arm almost all the way into a burrow to try to capture White River crayfish. And the sizes of the age classes of these crayfish was quite large. We found 2 to 3 different age classes, and they ranged in size. Their carapace length was 33 to 54 millimeters, which, if you know, are very large crayfish. Sorry, if you don't know, are very large crayfish for Ontario. And we did find that all the females did not have eggs, but females did have glare, meaning that they were probably going to go through a reproductive cycle at some point in the near future. So this was the same day in July. There's another photo of that burrow. One of the burrows, we found many. Photo of us with the first one that we captured. We were smiling because it was a nice sunny day and we happened to find what we were looking for. It's unfortunate because we did discover a new inland invasive species in Ontario, but we had suspicions they were already there based on the photos from a naturalist. And because of that, we had already developed signage for that location and the others to encourage people not to transport crayfish above or over land. It is against the law to transport crayfish over land. Dead, alive, native, invasive, doesn't matter. And as you can see from that sign, Procambarus had drawn the drawing for us of the crayfish, and then we got photos from Dr. Thomas Hosey. And speaking of him, he actually was the one who installed signage for us on Pelee Island as well. So we have these signs all around the areas where white river crayfish have been found. Then finally, in September 2023, we went back again, and we went out with Credit Valley Conservation staff, and we did day and night sampling. We did hand netting, snorkeling, baited traps, you name it. We did happen to find a female with eggs, as you can see in the top left there. So we did see them with glare before, so we were suspicious that we might encounter a female with eggs, and we did. There's some other photos there from the surveillance, including premix showing the gonopods of the white river crayfish. So not only did we find them, but we'll find more of them. We also found them in the adjacent McLean Lake. So all of a sudden, we were dealing with a larger distribution than we initially thought. So next steps, we're going to continue to monitor. This photo here is from Sturgeon Bay. This was another iNaturalist photo that was put on the website from one of my colleagues, Patrick Jackson, who works with Severn Sound Environmental, who I've worked very closely with over the years. And it just shows us that this range is much larger than we expected, and we're going to continue to map that out to understand its true distribution in Ontario. We are providing tracking initiatives for people. We've added the species to EDMAPS Ontario, so that's the Early Detection and Distribution Mapping System, so to Ontario's list of species. We've also added it as a reportable species to iNaturalist to our project, so the Invasive Species in Ontario project. And then finally, with funding from the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, thank you so much. They were able to provide us with the funding to produce a crayfish guide for Ontario, a guide to Ontario's crayfishes, I should say. And this guide actually does include all of the species for all of Canada, but does have a focus on Ontario. So if you'd like to get your hands on some, please feel free to reach out to me. And with that, I'll end off and say, thank you so much. We're going to continue to work diligently to understand this species, where it's found, the impacts that it's having, and a big thank you to Dr. Procambarus for all of his assistance in monitoring for these species and bringing it to our attention. He's the one who's constant on the lookout for crayfishes online and notifying us when they are found. So with that said, I'd like to thank you so much for the opportunity to present today. And like I said, if you like a guide or if you have any follow-up questions, please feel free to email me, Brooke_Schreier@ofah.org. Thanks so much.